Welcome, Life Science learners, to another installment of Life Sciences. Well, I'm sure you guys are ready for the next installment of what we're preparing you for your year ahead. Looking at grade 12 and 11, we know that the environment and the effect that humans have on it is a significant topic. This is a section that's normally done in grade 11, but we also follow through this into grade 12, which is where it's assessed. So today we're looking at human impact on the environment, and specifically we're looking at the atmosphere and climate change. And guys, climate change is a hot topic. Excuse the pun on the word hot, but today we're going to look at and focus on the effects that humans have had on the atmosphere and what those consequences have been in terms of for the earth. And I think it's crucial that we all have a good understanding. Throughout grade 10, 11 and 12, we often focus on humans. We look at ecology, we look at human impact in the environment. But I often need to remind learners that this is a human skill that we need to carry through, not just for school, but to us to understand the impact that we have on the environment. And I think what better way to start off as in grade 10, 11 and 12, where we understand the impact that we have and we become stewards of the environment as we go out into the world and finish our education. Lots of you have the opportunity to have a big and significant impact on the environment. So let's try and see what our impact is, and let's try and act on that as we, one, understand what the content is, and two, see the relevance that this has to us in terms of the future, and three, how we act today so that we ensure that the future of this environment is protected, not just for us, but for the next generations to come. So let's get to the chase. Right, so in our lesson today, we're going to focus on the impact that we've had. Have you ever thought about the following? How different will Earth be if humans thought about their consequences and our actions? And I think this goes back to thinking of what impact we have on the environment. It starts from simple things like currently throwing away litter and where we dispose of that, saving electricity, using water wisely. And so these are simple steps that we have to consider in terms of our impact on the environment. And for us to understand that impact, we've got to understand the context of the environment, the context of what happens in nature in terms of naturally. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So in our lesson, we obviously start off with a brain teaser. And so today the question is, some of the global warming that has been observed throughout the 20th century can be attributed to the following: A, human impact; B, plant growth; C, glacier melting; or D, droughts. So guys, these are the options that you have, and I'm hoping that through the lesson that we go through today, that you're able to think about what has had a significant impact on global warming. We will try and unpack what global warming is, and then try and reflect on which of these would have been a significant contributor to the global warming that we're currently experiencing on Earth as we speak. Right, so some of our key concepts today and that we're going to look at, and we'll unpack these as we get into the lesson, is the concept of what is atmosphere. And if you go back to grade 10, when we looked at biomes and we looked at biosphere, we spent a lot of time looking at atmosphere and what makes up the atmosphere. We're going to talk about climate change today, and in terms of what happens on Earth and what are the indicators of the climate changing. We're going to look at what the greenhouse effect is as a natural phenomena, and we're going to look at in terms of what are the gases that contribute to the greenhouse gases. We can look at those. We're also going to look at the impact that carbon dioxide emissions has on the environment. And we also need to spend some time looking at what methane emissions are and how these contribute to the greenhouse enhanced effect. We're going to spend some time looking at carbon footprint and what this means to us as individuals. We also need to look at the concept of global warming, something that has come into existence not recently, but in terms of people becoming very conscious about the environment. Biodiversity. As a country that we live in, we know that we're living in a country that is highly diverse, having a variety of living organisms, and we need to understand the context of what our impact has on biodiversity. We also need to look at the concept of desertification in terms of how land is becoming arid and dry, and land that cannot be now cultivated for crop or for the use of animal feeding. We also need to look at the concept of deforestation, not just in the context of South Africa, but in terms of the global context. So the first question, what is greenhouse effect? And I'm sure you guys would have heard of this concept, the greenhouse effect. And to understand this concept, I've put in an illustration, and that's to look at why the Earth experiences the temperatures we currently are experiencing, and what is this in terms of, why is this important for us in terms of our existence on Earth. So to understand this, I've got an image in here that shows you what happens during the greenhouse effect. For us to understand this, we've got to look at, firstly, let's try and unpack what does it mean in terms of the temperature on Earth. Now, have you ever thought about why do we have a temperature on Earth that supports the existence of life? Now, if we think of other planets, and if you did do some reading around planets, the temperatures on planets are very different to the temperatures we are experiencing. Some planets are extremely hot, some planets are extremely cold, and so in terms of we as humans considering moving to another planet, one of the greatest challenges that we will face is humans adapting to very different temperatures. Temperatures that do not have any correlation to what we currently experience on Earth. And so that poses a huge challenge. So we got to understand why, or what are the reasons that the Earth has this temperature range that allows humans and the organisms that inhabit Earth to be able to survive. And so that's part of understanding the greenhouse effect. So when we look at the sun, we know that in grade 8 and 9 we talked about the energy, the radiant energy that comes from the sun. And when we try and understand this, remember that the sun provides solar radiation, and this is the radiation that is going to warm the Earth up. And we know that if you stand in the sun on a warm winter day, you feel your body warming up, and that's the radiation, and that's the energy that you feel from the sun. So we refer to that as solar radiation. But let's understand what happens with that solar radiation as it passes through a layer of gas which we call the atmosphere surrounding the Earth. So we have a layer of atmosphere here, and if you look through this, that's that little band that we see, and it's made up of different gases that are surrounding the Earth. And this layer of gas is very important in terms of what maintains the temperature on Earth, and so that's what we're going to look at now. We also know that the Earth serves as a reflective surface, meaning that lots of the radiation that hits onto the surface of the Earth bounces back. And so we see that happening in this. So we see that the radiation touches the surface of the Earth and is reflected back off the Earth. And that's essentially the heat that comes off the Earth and is sent back into the atmosphere, that warms up the atmosphere. So some of that heat escapes out of the atmosphere, but we also know that some of that heat is reflected back onto Earth. And that is what keeps the Earth at a temperature that we experience throughout any part of the world that we go to. So the Earth experiences three things. It warms up because the heat goes through the atmosphere, bounces off the surface of the Earth, and then leaves, which is good for the Earth. But some of that we know bounces back onto the surface of the Earth off this layer that we see called the atmosphere. So that layer allows for some of the heat or this radiation to bounce back. And this is what warms the Earth's surface up, maintaining the average temperature which we experience throughout the Earth. And so that's, in a nutshell, what happens on the Earth in terms of the greenhouse effect. Now, in order for the Earth to experience this greenhouse effect, we've got to consider what are the gases in the atmosphere that allow for some of that heat to pass through, but also to be reflected back onto the surface of the Earth by the atmosphere. So we know that the greenhouse gases are made up of a different collective compounds of gases. So let's see, the first gas that we talk about is carbon dioxide, and we know that carbon dioxide is naturally produced, and we see that. We see methane as part of the atmosphere. We know that there's a lot of water vapor that evaporates from the surface of the Earth in terms of our ocean bodies. Nitrous oxide is another gas that's present, and we know that there's an ozone layer that collectively form part of this layer of gases that constitutes the atmosphere. What is crucial for us to note is that these gases results in the Earth having a stable global temperature throughout the year. And that's essentially the greenhouse effect. It's take those gases, wrap the Earth around it in these layers, and that is what ensures that the temperature around the Earth and that we experience is maintained within a stable global temperature. And so what happens when these gases change in their composition? So that's what we're going to look at in a bit. So some synthetic gases are also greenhouse gases. For example, your chlorofluorocarbons. And by synthetic, I mean these are gases that are produced due to human activity. Hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, you've got your perfluorocarbons, and you've got your sulfur hexafluorides. Now guys, these are just exposing you to some of them. It's not important that you remember these gases, but I think it's good that you have an indication in terms of when you see these as to what these synthetically produced gases are that contribute to also some of the greenhouse gases. We also know that the concentration of these are a combination of natural and synthetic gases that are what is present in the atmosphere. And these have unfortunately increased exponentially over the last 2 centuries. And a lot of that has been due to the Industrial Revolution. And if we go back and look at the Industrial Revolution during the 18th century, this was when humans had made significant strides in terms of the way technology advanced, in terms of we looked at during the World War and the Industrial Revolution that took place in terms of the manufacture of equipment, cars, the fact that we started producing coal and coal-powered locomotive and industries. Those industries were contributing significantly to the emissions of greenhouse gases. So now we have got natural greenhouse gases, but we've got more gases that have been produced due to human activity. And so the impact of these have had a significant consequence on the global temperatures since then. And so we are going to look at that in the next graph. So the main greenhouse gases are, as I discussed, water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, nitrous oxide, and your chlorofluorocarbons. This pie chart illustrates essentially a proportion distribution of these greenhouse gases. We know that a large percentage of them are made up of carbon dioxide. We also know that that's produced predominantly by your fossil fuels. And then we see a smaller contribution of that from land use. We also know that some of them are produced by chemical reactions. We see that methane makes up 16%, and that often comes from naturally from the earth, but also from lots of animals and fermentation that occurs. We know that nitrous oxide makes up a smaller percentage, and your chlorofluorocarbons, which make up 2%. And so this graph essentially shows you the proportion of these various gases that are present in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? As we wrap up this session, guys, we're going to talk about what these gases are and globally where they're produced from. So these primary sources of greenhouse gases are electricity and heating, which makes up 31%. We also know that agriculture is a significant contributor to that. Transportation, both road, air, and sea, contribute to 15% of that. Forestry, in terms of the industry that uses power tools to actually remove these trees, and the impact of removing them has a significant impact on the greenhouse gases. And in terms of the manufacturing sector, in terms of global manufacturing, 12% that contributes to these gases. So the energy production of all accounts for 72% of all emissions. So guys, we've looked at greenhouse gases, we've looked at all of these point to human impact, and so the impacts of industry, the impacts of technology, and how that has contributed to these greenhouse gases. So in our next segment, I'd like to show you a projection of how these greenhouse gases have changed over the last 10, 15, or rather 20, 30 years, and we need to then unpack what is it that this is having on the earth. So you guys have done well. I think you guys need a good break, hydrate, come back, and we'll join the next session where we look at more greenhouse impact on the earth.